Hi, I'm Mark Hummel. Welcome to the Harmonica party. We'd like to invite you to be a guest at the party. You can do that by supporting us right here at Patreon. See you then. My name is Mark Hummel, and welcome to Mark Hummel's Harmonica Party. And our guest today is the original drummer for Big Brother and the Holding Company, Dave Getz. And we're in Marin at his house, and we're just getting going about how you started in music. You said you were 15?
I was 15. I joined a band. I actually didn't even play the drums, but they just said, "You're the drummer," kind of thing. And I started this band. I didn't start the band. I joined it. I was asked to be in it. And we played in hotels and club dates and, weddings, bar mitzvahs, things like that.
And what kind of music were you guys playing?
It was dance music. It was mostly music from the 30s and 40s. It's what's called now American Songbook.
Oh, okay.
And standards, but we played rumbas and cha-chas and things like that. Not rock and roll, not at all. It was sort of really before rock and roll became the popular music of the day. And so I was in high school, and I did gigs on weekends, and in the summer times I played in hotels in the Catskill Mountains. And I did that from about the time I was 15 to the time I was 19. And then when I was 19, I played in a Dixieland band that was called Rick Lundy and the Saints. And we played on the Holland America lines going to Europe. And we went to Europe, and then I hitchhiked around Europe, and then we played a bunch of concerts in Germany and Holland, and then played on the Holland America lines coming back. So I did that. And then from about the time I was 20 to the time I was 26 and joined Big Brother, I really didn't play the drums much at all. I was going to art school, and I wanted to be an artist. So,
now, did you have lessons when you were drumming?
I did.
I had
in the beginning, when I was asked to join this band when I was 15. One of the guys in the band, his father had a music studio, local neighborhood music studio, and he picked a drummer for me that was in Manhattan. And his name was Doug Allen, and he was like part of the Henry Adler School of Music. It was a drumming school. And I would go every Wednesday into Manhattan and take a lesson. And it was all like rudiments and really basic, nothing like, I wasn't supposed to be playing drums even. I was just supposed to be learning the rudiments. And I did that for about a year. And I secretly was playing in the band and learning how to play a foxtrot and a rumba and all of the stuff like that, swing. But that was the lessons basically that I took.
Now, when I met you, you said you considered yourself a jazz drummer in the early days. Is that right?
Yeah, I played a lot of traditional jazz. I wanted to play bebop. I wanted to play more modern jazz, and a lot of the guys I came up with in New York when I was 15, 16, 17, that time, some of them, really had, developed the kind of chops you need to play contemporary jazz. And I was good. I was more like a natural. I did take some lessons, but that's not really how I learned to play the drums. I just learned to play the drums by playing the drums in bands. And I was kind of a natural, and I got some technical skill, but I didn't practice enough to really, I didn't think I would, have a career in bebop and, what was happening in New York at that time, the guys who were coming up, who really, were developing this high skill level. And now it's even beyond that, but in that day. So I really didn't want to be like a musician. I didn't. I wanted to do it on the side, and I loved playing. I loved playing gigs and getting gigs, and I always got gigs because I had a good feel. But I didn't want to go into music as a career.
It sounds like you kind of jumped out of the bag pretty much to a roaring start if you were doing tours of Europe on
Yeah,
ships and
I
things
know.
like that.
And that's just because I was kind of a naturally good and I could play and I kind of had a sense of, what how to play the drums.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like I say, I got gigs. I even belonged to, when I was 15, I belonged to the union. I joined
Wow.
Local 802. And
Yeah.
in those days, that was, you had to be in the union to play a lot of gigs, to
Right.
play at hotels and
Right.
a lot of restaurants, and a lot of things were union. And so I joined the union, and I would sometimes go down to the Union Hall, which was in Manhattan. It was like Roseland Ballroom on
Right.
Wednesday afternoons. And I'd go down, and sometimes I'd get gigs. There'd be calls for drummer wanted, must be able to play a merengue, stuff like that. And I would do that. And I was good enough to somehow make it, but like I say, I didn't really pursue it. I didn't really work at it to the level that if I wanted to, really have a career at it. I didn't work at it that hard. And some of the guys that I knew did, and they became, major jazz players in New York.
Now, how about your art career? How did you go to art school?
Well, that was what I wanted to do. That was what I really wanted to do. Was I wanted to be an artist, and it's a long story in itself. But I think a lot of it was that I could do art. It's something that I could do all day long. Whereas like practicing, I couldn't sit down and practice for 7 hours. Some guys could. Some kids I knew did that. They really, But I could paint or draw for 7 hours. I could do that. And so I had that kind of intensity, and I was also really good at it. In high school, it's competitive, and I, was maybe one of the best artists in the high school. And then I got into a really very, very difficult to get into art school, which was Cooper Union in New York. It was the kind of thing where it was free, but it was very, very exclusive. About maybe 1,500 kids would take the test to get in every year, and they accepted like 90 to 100 in each class year. So I got into Cooper Union, and then I got, a scholarship when I got out of Cooper Union to a place called Skowhegan. And then when I came out
that's
here,
up in Maine.
In Maine,
Yeah.
right? And then after I went to Maine, I came back from Maine, and I had gotten into Yale. I was going to go to Yale Art School to get getting my degree, which was part of the whole thing of part of it was my parents, that they didn't want me to be an artist. They were afraid that you would, not have a way to make a living.
Starve.
So I wanted to have a degree, and I could teach and all of that. But then I blew off Yale, and I came out to San Francisco when I was 20, and I went to the San Francisco Art Institute.
Oh.
And I got a master's degree at the Art Institute. Probably only rock and roll guy in the early 60s who had a master's degree. But I had a master's degree, and then I won a Fullbright Fellowship, which was a big deal. And I lived in Europe for a year. I went to Poland, and I lived in Krakow for a year. And was when I was in Krakow was when I started to play the drums again, because I went. I had a studio that they gave me at the Art Institute there in Krakow, and it started to fill up with other students, and they, it's a communist government. It's 1965. It's a communist country, and anyway, that's another whole long story. But I got sort of crowded out of my studio, and I just found it very hard to paint. So I started to hang out in the jazz club. There was a jazz club in Krakow, and one night I sat in, and all of a sudden I had people asking me to be in their band. So I was like in 2 or 3 bands in Poland, and I was making money. I was like, it's really a strange place because it was this very poor country at the time, and what I was getting from the government as my, what they call a stipendium for a Fullbright Fellow, was like twice of what a worker, average, a robotnik would be making with a family. I was getting already double that. And then I started to make a lot of money playing in different bands all over Poland. And and there was nothing to buy. And the money then, Polish money, the zloty, was like you couldn't exchange it. It was not transferable into dollars or any kind of other kind of money. So like I would just kind of take people out and we'd drink and have dinner. I was just sort of buying stuff for my friends, and that's what I did in Poland. I basically wound up the last 3 or 4 months I was there mostly just playing music. And I got to play at one point with something called the Polish Jazz Quartet, which was the premier group at that time, because that drummer got sick and they were playing Krakow, and they needed a drummer. And I was like maybe the best drummer in Krakow, which is not saying a lot at that time, because they had a lot of great piano players, of course, because they had that Chopin tradition in Poland. And they had a lot of good string players and horn players, but there weren't a lot of good drummers. Now there's phenomenal drummers in Poland and Eastern Europe and all over the place. But at that time, I could like, was in demand. I could play jazz. I could swing. That was basically the thing. A lot of the guys who were trying to play drums, they didn't understand the swing, the swing feel. Anyway, so that's when I started playing again. Then I came back to San Francisco and I got hired to teach at the Art Institute, which is really crazy. I was like 25 years old. And I got a job teaching beginning and intermediate painting at the Art Institute. And I had a studio in the Mission District on 18th and Bryant, and I had an apartment in North Beach. And I was working the teaching job, and I was also working as a cook in the old spaghetti factory in North Beach. It was another thing I did. And one day I met Peter Albin. That's really how I got into Big Brother. I met Peter Albin because downstairs from my studio in the Mission District was a cafe. And Peter was working in a screen printing place down the street called Radon that printed sweatshirts and t-shirts and screen printed t-shirts and stuff. And I saw this guy with long hair in the cafe. We both were eating lunch. And I just started a conversation with him, and he said, he was in this band. I said, what's the name of the band? He said, Big Brother. I said, I've heard of that band. Yeah, I want to hear you guys. And then, as it happens, the next weekend, they were playing at the Fillmore in a thing called the Peace Rock. This is, of course, before Janis, It was just a quartet. And I went to that, and I heard them. And I would see Peter after that in the cafe. And I said, you guys are great, but the drummer is really not good. The drummer's your weak link. And so if you ever fire him, give me a call. And sort of the rest is history.
So was that 66?
That was 66. That was January, basically. I heard them at the Peace Rock was February 12th, 66. And my first gig with them was March 10th, I think, at the Matrix in 66. And that was it. And then I tried to sort of keep teaching. I thought I could sort of keep painting and do both things. But I found that when Janis joined the band, that we had to all make a commitment. We had to make some kind of a commitment.
Things really took off.
And we all lived together, and we all moved out of the city to Lagunitas, and that was the end of painting for me for about almost 13 years. I didn't do any art at all. So,
Did you come back to art later on?
Yeah. And then,
You must have been really good.
It's my life is so back and forth between. Now's the time when I do actually both. Mm-hmm. But for a long time, I couldn't do any art. My life was just too taken up with being in the bands. Mm-hmm. And then in 79, the band that I was in LA, which was a band called Passengers, we didn't get the final record contract deal, and it fell apart. And after we'd been together about 5 years, and I rented a studio in Santa Monica. I learned how to do screen printing. I knew a little bit about it because I'd been involved in a screen printing t-shirt company with people Mouse and Kelly back in the early 70s when I was still living in Marin. So I knew about screen printing, and I wanted to learn how to do it as an artist, as to sort of make prints. and I did, and that's what I did for the next 7-8 years, basically between 1979 and 1987. Again, I didn't do much drumming. I mostly did art. I was for a while. I was in a band. I had a little band with a guy named John York, who was had been in the Byrds with Gene Clark, and he was a great singer songwriter. And I just got to know him because he rented. I had part of my studio I had rented out for. It was like a separate room, and he came along and needed a place to rehearse. So I became friends with this guy, and we started to do a little rehearsing together. But we never played anywhere. I think we did one gig maybe in the whole 2 years that we were playing together. But mostly between 79 and 87, I really didn't play much music. I didn't perform at all. I had a set of drums always in my studio, and I would practice sometimes to sit down and play as like therapy. But I didn't. I wasn't in any kind of I wasn't making any money out of it.
Right.
Except some royalties coming in here and there. But there was also sort of a time of when there wasn't much coming in, and mostly I was depending on other things to make a living.
So was art a way of making a living for you?
Partly it was. I almost made a living at it. I didn't ever get to the point where I really could say that I made a living. But you have a lot of things. It's sort of, when you get to a certain age, you figure out ways. So I sold art. I had a lot of people representing my work in LA. And then sometimes I had jobs. I did construction with people. I did a cooking job at a very fancy restaurant for a while. I had rent coming. I rented my house in Fairfax here. I had rent coming in. Every once in a while, there'd be a royalty check. My wife worked. We just, we made it. We just survived.
Found a way. Yeah.
As one does.
Yeah. So another question I had. You said the band moved to Lagunitas. What year was that Big Brother moved to Lagunitas?
That was in the beginning of July, I think 66.
Really? So you guys weren't living in the Haight during that time?
No. Peter lived in the Haight. Janice, when she first came, the first month she was in it, she came in June. She came in early June. And she was living on Pine Street in a furnished room with a guy named Travis Rivers. James and Sam were both living in the Haight in, sort of small apartments in buildings that had been converted into rooms and things like that. Peter had a real apartment. Peter was married and had a kid. Mm-hmm. James had a kid too. James was married and had a kid too, but he was really living on the edge. And then, because I had an apartment. I had a great apartment. I had an apartment in North Beach, which I hated to give up, up on Kearney above Green and Kearney. But we had to live together. Janice really needed a place to live. She needed to get out of where she was. And James and Sam both didn't have good living situations. Peter and I both had apartments, but we were willing to sort of give it up and move in with the whole band communally. And that was sort of a thing that was happening at the time. It was kind of in the zeitgeist, bands all sort of getting a house and living together.
So how long did that last in
that
Lagunitas?
Lasted for pretty much 5 to 6 months. By the end of the year, by the end of 66, everybody was really ready to get out of there. We found that, the living styles were really at odds with the way people lived.
You're singing Moran?
This was in Lagunitas.
Yeah. Okay.
But, there were just conflicts of lifestyle in the house, meaning some people were staying up all night using speed, and other people wanted, food in the refrigerator and the place cleaned.
So did you guys move back to San Francisco at that point?
Yeah, we all moved back to San Francisco in the beginning of 67. We all moved back. We all got apartments. And We got a manager. We got a new manager there.
And what was his name? I think.
Julius
I heard.
Carpin.
I heard him interviewed
Yeah.
on KPFA.
He died 2-3 years ago.
Right. And he was your manager, as I recall, through Monterey or something, and then
all of '67,
and then
Albert Grossman.
Grossman took over. Yeah,
That's
Albert
right.
Grossman. And for those of you that don't know, Albert Grossman was the biggest manager pretty much in the rock scene at that time. I mean, he had Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Paul Butterfield, and Bob Dylan, the band, and then eventually, you guys.
He had Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Gordon Lightfoot,
right,
and the band eventually, and Nick Gravenitis,
and Gravenitis, right? The Electric
Flag.
Yeah.
But most people don't know about Albert was that he owned, a certain percentage, a large percentage of Bob Dylan's publishing,
right,
which made him a very rich man.
I know Nick had a story about staying at Grossman's house and how he opened up a chest and there were all these Bob Dylan original songs that had been written out by him. Yeah, and they were just lying in a chest somewhere in his house. Yeah. But basically, when Grossman took over, that was kind of the beginning of the end of Big Brother in a sense, right?
You could say that in a way. I think Monterey, you could say, was the beginning of the end of Big Brother, in my mind, because it really focused. It suddenly became that Janis became the total focus of the band, and Peter before Monterey, and even after Monterey, Peter Albin was the leader of the band. He had formed the band, and he was the guy who was the most responsible. And he signed the contracts, and he dealt more with Julius, and he was the person who coordinated things between the people in the band. And after Monterey, Janis really, what she wanted to happen was going to happen. She had
she became the star.
She had her hand on the. She had her hands on the wheel.
Yeah. So, would you say that prior to Grossman, it was much more of a love fest by comparison?
I don't know about love fest, but it was definitely more like communal, and equal. We actually, even into the end, we were equals in terms of money. We always split the money equally. Janis always just got one share, fifth.
Right.
It was kind of an equal kind of thing, and people would, in terms creatively, it was definitely more equal to, people would contribute ideas and people would contribute songs. But at a certain point after Monterey, Janis wanted to do certain material, and it started to move in a certain direction. But I have to tell a story here, because it's just about, what you said about Albert Grossman.
Mm-hmm.
That Albert was a businessman. He really was a businessman. But a certain side of him kind of was trying to kind of understand what Big Brother was about. I don't think he did, but he was trying to, in a way. And he knew we were, a band of equals in terms of that we were all creative people. Each of us saw each other as creative, as creative input, had creative input to it. But at one point, James Gurley became a problem. And
was that because of drugs?
Because of drugs, and because his playing was of a certain style that it couldn't really go anywhere. He did James Gurley. He did what he did. And it wasn't like a guy who could really have. We talked about this on Facebook. This is about the fundamentals of the blues, of playing fundamental styles that were at that time that people were sort of really mastering and bringing. Like you had people like Eric Clapton all of a sudden becoming fan. Guys who the skill level started to get much higher than it was in 1966. There were guys who really could play blues, Jimi Hendrix, and a bunch of other guys, and even Jerry Garcia. Um, and James could only do what James did. James was like, it's hard to say what he was. He had his own style. It was very original and unique, and it was more in some way about sound and noise and expression than it was about like notes and melody. And in some way, where Janice was going musically was a whole other direction, more toward like fundamental music, and she was going towards soul. She was listening to Otis Redding a lot. She was listening to Etta James and people, and she wanted to sort of really absorb that style and play in that style and play with musicians who could play in that style. And James really couldn't go there at all. Sam and Peter and myself could to a great degree. We started to adapt to that and get better as players. But James couldn't. And James then had this drug problem and this also an alcohol problem, second-all problem, and a lot of different problems, and started to kind of get very sloppy and fell off the stage one performance. But anyway, back to Albert. Albert, at some point, early on when he took over the management, we were playing at a club in Huntington Beach called the Golden Bear. Mm-hmm. And Albert asked Janice, Peter, Sam, and myself to have a meeting with him. And he said, how about this? How about we give James $10,000 and we sort of ask him to sort of go out and take a break and see if he can sort of clean himself up and get his act together. And we could get a really great guitar player to replace him. And you know what we all said? No, we can't. We're like family. We can't do that to James. And I think Albert at that point said, okay, well, that's it. Then it's Janice. I want Janice.
It was pretty much his way or the highway.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. It was. And we, in a way, when I go back and I think about it now, I kind of wish we'd done that, because I think it was actually, he was right. That ultimately, it ultimately really took the band down. And when we finally got back together in the early 70s, we had James play bass.
Really?
James didn't play guitar anymore in the early 70s. He became the bass player, and Peter took over guitar, and we got a guy named Dave Shallock, and a Nick sometimes played guitar, and we had really good guitar players who could play, who could go other places, And James became an interesting bass player. That's a whole other thing that happened. He went through a whole trial. His wife OD'd and died, and he was tried for murder.
Oh my God.
He was tried for second-degree murder, and after that, he cut his hair and everything, and he changed. He changed, and he said, "I'm not going to play guitar anymore. Play bass." And for a couple of years, it really worked. We had a different kind of thing. We didn't do cheap thrills. We didn't do any of Janice music. We did all new music.